Hey guys, how we doing? So we're back on another JoJo's Bizarre Adventure themed video. I'm still obsessed. This is why you should watch JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 2, which was called Battle Tendency, I do believe. This was a strange series. Like, I loved it, don't get me wrong. It just really started to go quite out there. Like, it's strange anyway, but like, so after you see Part 1 and everything with Dio, and I was like, okay. And then now it's like, we got these mad, like, people that could do all sorts of crazy stuff and could, like, morph inside people, and we've got a German, like, dude that turns into a robot, and, like, what? So, let's just, oh, and where's my drink? Let's get into this. Why you should watch JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 2.
I love Phantom Blood. Hell, I did
It was really good. Phantom Blood was class. Part 1 was great.
Video on it, and if you haven't seen that, then you should go watch it.
Which we checked out last week.
Because A,
it was good.
It's good, and B, this is not only a why you should watch JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 2, but also a Part 2 of my why you should watch JoJo's Bizarre Adventure series.
Yes, of course it
also,
is.
we've got heavy spoilers for Part 1 incoming, so be warned, because we're kicking off right now. When I do videos, I try and stay away from the idea that any one piece of media is objectively superior to another. Sure, I'll call out individual aspects of shows and talk about why I think one is better than the other, but objectively ranking series has never really sat right with me.
No.
It tends to lead to all kinds of pedantic arguments that eventually devolve into taking both shows
that's why this
down
one's better than
in order
that
to
one,
expose
but this
which
one's better than
has
that
the
one because of
greatest
this
weakness,
reason.
as if that somehow mitigates their stronger aspects. Now, with all that in mind, today I'd like to talk about how I feel that JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 2 is the objectively superior part to Part 1, and how this is mainly due to a shift in writing style by author Hirohiko Araki. This is arguably when Araki really came into his own as a writer,
right,
and when his own ideas began to grow stronger within him than those of his influences. And this becomes apparent nearly instantly when viewing the bold and outlandish world of JoJo's Part 2.
God, yes.
And so with that, we step forward, charge our Hamon, be aware that the surprise was vampires, and let's talk about why you should watch JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 2, Battle Tendency. Battle Tendency opens in pre-World War II, 1938, New York City, with the brand new protagonist, the outlandishly silly and stunningly handsome Joseph Joestar. It tells the story of Joseph and his battle against the ancient evil of the Pillar Men, taking place approximately 50 to 60 years after the events of Part 1. For a good and dirty indicator of just how different these two parts are, it's worth comparing the openings, Part 1's Sonoshida Sadime and Part 2's Bloody Stream, both stunningly animated by Studio Kamikaze Toga. Whereas Part 1's opening is dark, considered and melodramatic, Part 2's bold colours and stylized silhouettes give it a wildness and energetic confidence.
And I think it's just like,
and I think a lot of credit is due to Kamikaze Toga.
We're going a little bit crazy.
This shift in tone is the exact same shift I feel when comparing Parts 1 and 2 as a whole. Part 1, while still hugely enjoyable, has a nearly clumsy and apologetic air to a lot of its storytelling. You can feel the places where Araki struggles with his characters and the composition of his narrative. But Part 2, on the other hand, has a bold confidence of a writer who's really figured out what he's about for the first time.
Yeah,
and
he's
this
like,
is reflected
this is
in no better place than with our brand new protagonist, Joseph Joestar. And the part I'd really like to focus on here for the moment is the fact that he's brand new. Upon first viewing Battle Tendency, I was sure that Jonathan would come back in some capacity, and when I learned that this wasn't the case, I was outraged. Was my gentlemanly giant really going to be
where's my main character
by this brash young asshole? And yes, in fact he was. But of course, it's only really in hindsight that I've come to appreciate what a brave decision this was.
Yeah, it is.
To give you some context here,
to
this
change the main
was
character
made in 1987, and at this time, manga for the most part were their main character. Large-scale supporting casts didn't really exist then like they do today, and so series tended to be focused much more on the main protagonist. Fist of the North Star was Kenshiro, Astro Boy was, Astro Boy. So concerned was Araki by this that he made the designs of Jonathan and Joseph extremely similar, so that people at a glance could still identify that it was indeed the same manga.
It's not too much
Something
of a
he'd
major
later
shift.
talk about regretting given how the JoJo's character design evolved over time. But why? What's the reason for this change in character? Well, I talked a lot in Part 1 about how Araki nearly felt limited by Jonathan. Jonathan, and so wiping the slate clean and starting again was his way of overcoming that. And while the two's appearance is indeed similar, the real game changer here is not an external one, but an internal. And to properly explain this, I'd like to take a moment and go not even back to the early days of anime, but to the early days of animation as a whole. 1927 heralded the first appearance of the now legendary Mickey Mouse in his short film Steamboat Willie. In this delightful little short, the characters are mostly used just to deliver all kinds of visual comedy, and it's pretty entertaining. Mickey plays a few songs, meets a cute girl mouse, abuses animals for about 4 straight minutes, and it's all simple fun. But it was missing something in its story that would be introduced into mainstream animation with the reintroduction of Felix the Cat in 1936. It is short, The Goose That Laid the Golden Egg. You see this scene right here? You see how he paces back and forth before coming up with an idea? This is Felix the Cat's trademark. He does it in practically every short he appears in. But, believe it or not, this was a huge step forward for the medium of animation. Why, you may ask? Because this right here is evidence of internal mechanics. Back in a lot of early cartoons, animated characters didn't really think. They didn't have a thought process. They just sort of did. The primary motivator usually being the entertainment of the audience rather than being the character's own needs and wants. But with Felix, all of a sudden we had an animated character who planned, who thought about things. He had his own internal logic, and this is what would govern his actions. If I was to put a point on this, it would be that Mickey did, while Felix decides. To bring this back into context a little, Jonathan is Mickey Mouse, Joseph is Felix the Cat. Jonathan is a good, nice, simple boy, and while it makes him likable, it also makes him extremely reactionary and predictable. There's never a great deal of subtlety in his actions or character. He wins fights because he's strong, and he's strong because he's a good guy. Which, for the most part, is how many manga heroes of the 80s were written. Heroes like Kenshiro, Violence Jack, and Riki-Oh. These guys didn't need to be especially nuanced or smart. They were designed as pure physical power fantasies.
look at them.
And thus their emotions and actions didn't need to be complicated. If they were happy, they'd smile. If they were angry, they'd punch something. They had a single layer. That's how they were designed, and that was their purpose. And then came Joseph. Much like Jonathan, Joseph possesses an exaggerated 80s action hero physique that was so popular back then. But despite this, his most dangerous weapons isn't his fists, his Tommy gun, his clacker volley, or even his Hamon energy. It is, in fact, his mind. Take the very first scene where we meet Joseph. After he has his wallet stolen by Smokey, he follows him only to find the young boy being assaulted and blackmailed by 2 corrupt police officers. He quickly disposes of one, only to have the other pull a gun on him, but then immediately warns the officer that if he pulls the trigger, Joseph will break his finger. Now, logically, there's no way this can happen. The distance between the two is too great, and unless the show is going to fudge Joseph's physical abilities, which wouldn't be a particularly interesting or clever solution, it looks like there's no way out. But then what actually happens is Joseph applies his Hamon energy to the Coke bottle, causing the carbonated pressure to build up
so stupid. It's brilliant.
The hapless cop's fingers. Fucking ridiculous? Yes. Entertaining as all hell?
Yes.
Absolutely. Joseph doesn't come out on top here because of his superior physical ability. He wins because he takes stock of his surroundings, creates a strategy that's hard to predict, and executes on it. Now compare this with the alleyway fight from part 1, where Jonathan dispatches a group of thugs, not through strategy, but simply through being really, really tough.
Just brute force.
No internal logic required. Both scenes take around the same amount of time, but which do you think is more memorable? This 40-second encounter is actually a preview of all Joseph's battles to come. We see him constantly outmatched by physically superior opponents.
We do.
Only for him to run the numbers, lay out some ludicrous scheme, and then pull it off with all the charisma and confidence that
How can I use my Hamon in a really
so
ridiculous way?
We don't always know what Joseph's thinking.
Hold the hand and then
a clear sense that the gears are turning, and this really sells him as a believable and fun character. And even more so when you take into the other way him and Jonathan differ. Their moral code. Jonathan is a righteous and upstanding young gent. He'd sooner die than take any action that would be deemed not proper. While Joseph, on the other hand, is a roguish trickster and swindler. He goads, he schemes, he flirts, and he never fights fair. In other words, he's about as far a cry from Jonathan as you can imagine. And I think writing such a different protagonist is what opened up Iraqi to this new style of internal character writing. Joseph is not the only character this applies to, however. Many of the other characters in Battle Tendency have their own motivations and logic that drive their actions. Caesar is driven by a fierce pride in his family, Strohenheim by loyalty to his country, and Lisa, well, I'm not sure about Lisa, but she's a fucking badass and I love her.
Yeah, there's that.
This is also the second major way that Battle Tendency totally eclipses Phantom Blood. Supporting cast are infinitely more interesting, memorable, and likeable than the forgettable cartoon characters of Part 1. Remember this guy? No, of course you don't, because he was about as exciting as watching ice melt. The most notable character here for me is Joseph's rival and eventual friend, the previously mentioned Caesar Spelli.
Yeah, he's
What's cool about Caesar is he is very much his own hero in his own story. Unlike many of the supporting cast of Part 1, Caesar does not just enter Joseph's life immediately and think he is the greatest thing in the world. In fact, at first, the two despise each other.
Yeah, they do. They don't get on. I love it.
Joseph and his trickster ways are a pathetic excuse for a Hamon user, a battle style created by Caesar's forefathers. Caesar's proud and arrogant nature is at complete odds with Joseph's boisterous and crude way of living. And the show does a fantastic job portraying the pair's early dislike of each other through some really great visual comedy-based scenes. I in particular love this moment when Caesar leaps 20 feet in the air, crosses his legs, and lands gracefully in the seat, purely to infuriate Joseph.
Amazing.
There's a lot of great little scenes like this early on, and it creates a real tangible feeling of dislike between the two characters. And while it's fun as hell to watch, it also makes it all the more believable later on when the two come to actually respect each other. At this point, we've seen the two face multiple life or death situations together,
when they're trying to
climb
up the thing,
there's a real sense that their friendship is one that's slowly built up over time, and in that time, the two have really learned to understand each other. Araki's always been good at portraying believable relationships between males. It's why Jonathan and Dio's rivalry from Part 1 worked so well, and also goes some ways to explain why such a large part of the JoJo's fandom is yaoi related. Well, that and they're all impossibly beautiful men, but I think camaraderie like this becomes an increasingly important part of JoJo's as it continues. It's cool. Even taking center stage in Part 5, which is nearly less about Giorno and more about the teenage boy mafia splinter cell he becomes a part of. Conveying friendship is never easy, and too many times we get throwaway lines of dialogue that are meant to convey a lifetime of friendship in a single sentence. But seeing Araki put the work in and really build up a relationship like this is extremely rewarding and satisfying.
Yeah.
Caesar, of course, isn't the only standout character here. Strohenheim, the flamboyantly menacing Nazi general, is, well,
brilliant.
Way more likable than a Nazi should be. Yeah. But I'm especially fond of Lisa, Joseph and Caesar's mentor. Back in 1987, it was pretty unusual in battle manga to have a woman portrayed as anything other than a love interest. Right. And usually an extremely shy and cute one, see Erina from Part 1. But in another JoJonium interview, Araki speaks about how he wanted to try and change those dynamics. In addition to functioning as someone's master, people weren't used to seeing a woman fight. Common sense dictates that the physically stronger would win, but I realized that if you add a supernatural element into the mix, then a woman can fight on even footing with a strong male opponent.
Interesting, like it.
In other words, if the battle is between those with supernatural powers, physical appearance has nothing to do with strength. The ripple is Lisa's supernatural ability. The idea of looks being irrelevant in supernatural abilities is what led to the introduction of stands in Part 3. This is yet another way that Part 2 challenges the conventions of the time, but also heralds a philosophy that takes root throughout Battle Tendency and would later become a defining characteristic of JoJo's. The emphasis being on a character's mental abilities over their physical ones. Yeah. It's interesting because as JoJo's goes on, there's a very noticeable decrease in the muscle mass of their protagonists. And I feel that Lisa was the progenitor to all this. Right, and this concept of mind over matter is also the driving force behind many of Part 2's extremely fun and insanely tactical battle scenes. The fights in Part 1 suffered a lot of the same kind of storytelling as many others shonen seinen mangas did in the early 80s. Ridiculous. And that is that nearly 100% designed as power fantasies, and thus no nuance is required in the fights. Take Fist of the North Star, arguably the progenitor of this style of power fantasy. The fights tend to follow a very simple kind of formula. It introduces a new villain, highlights how tough they are by having them defeat some minor or background characters, only to then have them utterly crushed by Kenshiro. Not through thought or strategy, but merely by virtue that Kenshiro is physically more powerful and therefore the superior fighter. I'm not exactly sure what happened to Araki between writing part 1 and 2, but his philosophy in writing battle scenes has totally changed here.
Yeah.
Completely gone are the simple masculinity contests of part 1, and replacing them instead is something far closer to the chess-like stand battles that would eventually become synonymous with JoJo's as a whole. The primary motivation for this seems to be Joseph himself. Whenever talking about him in an interview, Araki describes his style of Hamon as swindler or trickster, and Joseph himself, during the fight with AC/DC, refers to his fighting style as sleight of hand. Much like a magician, the emphasis is on misleading your opponent so they can't see what you're really
I love all the names that reference different bands and stuff.
And if you've already seen the fight with AC/DC, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Even more telling in this particular fight is the reference to Sun Tzu's Art of War, an ancient Chinese military tactics manual that puts a huge amount of emphasis on the importance of taking action to disorientate your opponent as opposed to trying to overwhelm them with force. The manual is still largely referenced in business and competitive sport today, and is an interesting read, its entire ethos being war through deception. Araki seems to have taken these lessons to heart, as Joseph, unlike Jonathan, never engages in bouts of physical strength, which is for the best because many of Joseph's fights involve him facing opponents who, if given the proper chance, could break every bone in his body with a simple flick of their wrist. Take the first major fight of the series, Joseph vs. Straits. Considering that Straits is now an immortal superpowered vampire, there's an ocean of difference between the two's physical ability. And to cross that ocean, Joseph will have to use every low-down, dirty, underhanded trick in the book. Before the fight even starts, Joseph ambushes Straits with a volley of Tommy gun.
Yeah, he just unloads.
Both entertaining and effective, this also gives us a decent insight into Joseph's mind. He's not interested in proving that he's physically superior to Straits, or that he's the more skilled or honorable fighter. Victory and survival is all that's on Joseph's mind, and he'll do whatever he has to get there. Again, a mindset that's completely at odds with his grandfather Jonathan, whose gentlemanly nature would probably be outraged by such tactics.
Definitely.
From here, Joseph sets trap after trap, constantly blindsiding Straits at every angle he can. The best example of this being when he hurls the grenade at Straits, only to have the vampiric super being knock it away, only then to reveal that that first grenade was actually attached to a load of other grenades. Pins of many other grenades that had already been attached to Straits' back. They then become active, engulfing the confounded Straits in a wild explosion. And this Tom and Jerry, or even David versus Goliath dynamic is what keeps the fights in part 2 so entertaining.
Yep.
Despite the fact that odds are consistently against Joseph, it's his brain that keeps him in the game. And he uses it not only to keep the opponents in the dark, but also us, the audience. We're never quite sure what Joseph's planning next, and this keeps us on the edge of our seats as we want to see his next major reveal. Made all the more fun by the fact that he shrouds this genius-level battle instinct with a goofy and outlandish persona. And it all adds up to make his fights a pure delight. The fight with Straits is indeed a fantastic one, but it happens right at the start of the series, and the main reason for this being that Araki wished to create a villain to surpass Dio, and by having Joseph overcome Straits, a being with more or less the same vampiric abilities as Dio, we establish a baseline from which we can introduce an even more powerful foe, the ancient and evil Pillarmen, made up of the battle-obsessed Wham, the bizarre AC/DC, and the ruthless and cold-blooded Cars. While vampires feed on humans, Pillarmen feed on vampires. They are the predators of our predators, and as such, humans are not even animals but insects to them, perfectly illustrated by this scene where Wham unknowingly steps through a German soldier, instantly killing him with all consideration of a child stepping on an ant. Further emphasizing this point is Joseph and Caesar's disastrous first major encounter with the Pillarmen.
Yeah, it does not go well.
The two are soundly defeated by Wham and given 1 month to train and try again. So amused are the Pillarmen by these tiny creatures that would dare stand up to them. This does a good job of setting the stakes for later encounters, but it also shows us an interesting side to the Pillarmen. These guys are creatures of honor. Unlike Joseph, they believe in a fair fight and warrior's pride, and it's interesting to watch the villains be the one who hold this ethos as opposed to the heroes. The later encounters with the Pillarmen are a total blast. Even 4 years after initially viewing them, I can still recall each individual beat of each fight, culminating in one of the greatest David versus Goliath style battles you're ever likely to see in Joseph versus Cars. I don't want to give too much away about it because you really just need to experience it for yourself, but take my word for it, it is awesome.
It's amazing.
And I'm probably going to talk about it more in a future video. Now, while I do think the Pillarmen are fun and interesting villains, this may be the only aspect of Battle Tendency that I feel doesn't quite match up to Phantom Blood, as these villains are simply not as unique or memorable as Dio. I mean, that's not to say the Pillarmen aren't interesting, they totally are, but just they never really matched Dio's level of diabolical bravado. Surpassing Dio is something that Araki would struggle with for some time to come, until at least part 4, with the introduction of one of my favourite characters of all time, the glorious Yoshikage Kira. The production of the anime is reasonably well handled. There's not
brilliant
really
villain.
a noticeable jump
I prefer
in
part
terms
3
of
over
visuals
4,
from part
but
1,
the villain in part
although
4,
all the bizarre colour
amazing.
shifts and interesting direction remain. But the animation is still pretty sparse in places, especially if you really stop and break down just how few frames are in some scenes. But the key poses are still well drawn enough that it never becomes too much of an issue. The audio, on the other hand, has gotten a significant boost. Both the sound effects and in particular the music have a distinct jump in quality here. Gone are the more traditional classical string pieces of part 1, and replacing them is a soundtrack brimming with 80s chic, fusing energetic 80s rock pop with a distinctly Eastern influenced electronic style. A particular favourite of mine being the track Awaken, used as the Pillarman's theme, although Stroheim's theme Propaganda is also a total blast. The English dub is fine, but honestly, this is one of those cases where I'm going to have to
not
really
watched any of the English
sub, lest you rob yourself of Sugita Tomokazu's delightful performance as Joseph, perfectly capturing his wild genius and his goofy trickster side. Richard Epcar's performance in the dub, on the other hand, really nails Joseph's foppish aloofness, but fails to capture his deeper layers. Although I would like to give a shout out to Chris Jai Alex's portrayal of AC/DC. He really nails both the confidence and bizarreness of that character. He hasn't done a lot of anime, but I'd really like to see him do more in the future. So, with all we've covered in part 2, it's safe to say that Araki has reworked a lot of the ways he approaches writing fiction in Battle Tendency. But there's one other way that I really feel Araki has advanced his efforts over part 1, and this is yet another thing that would stay consistent throughout his work over the years, and that is how Araki portrays death. Now, before I go on here, there's something I'd like to point out. Have you ever noticed how many deaths in film look like this? You brought me that much. But not this time.
No, Trinity.
Character A holds character B, insisting everything's going to be alright. While character B imparts some emotional final words before slowly slipping away. The clutching final embrace, I call it. I have two major problems with portraying death scenes like this. The first being just how overused they are. At this point, it's more of a storytelling contrivance than a piece of actual writing. I could list forever the amount of movies I've seen this in. Hell, it even happens twice in part 1. The second issue is that it always gives our characters the perfect amount of time to say their final goodbyes, when in reality, and often very tragically, death tends to come in one of two forms. Far too quickly, or far too slowly. And this perfectly comfortable final 90 seconds that so many movies, anime and TV shows afford their characters just doesn't really happen. Now with that in mind, I'm about to drop some major spoilers on the first 4 episodes of Grimgar of Fantasy and Ash, as well as the late episodes of Battle Tendency. So if you wish to avoid either, pause this video and go to the time indicated in the description. Grimgar in a lot of ways was an interesting show. There was at the same time a lot to like and dislike about it, but I did enjoy how brutally the show portrayed its world and fight scenes. There was a real feeling that these were struggles for survival rather than the usual anime skill contests. But if there was one thing that was totally obvious from the first 3 episodes, it's that the show was going to kill off one of its main characters. Myself and a friend even took bets on who it would be. My money was on Nice Guts, but as it turned out, it was Nice Mage Boy who would end up biting the dust. While I thought this was a good move for the show, this was also what made me drop it entirely, as I felt the portrayal of his death was so incredibly mismanaged. It completely robbed Grimgar of what should have been its finest moments. Rather than just letting the death happen, Grimgar felt a need to constantly signpost that it was coming, and then drag out the actual death itself. And it does this numerous times throughout the episode. For example, 1. We get the scene where two characters half admit to liking each other, a sure sign that someone ain't gonna make it to minute 22 of this episode.
No.
2. The narrator fucking tells us he's about to die. 3. He avoids the first arrow only to get hit later by a different arrow, which seems to have little or no effect on him until 4. The arrow actually did affect him, now he's dying. 5. Boom, final clutching embrace. And then 6. Priest guy has to be the one to tell us that he is actually dead. And hey, an upskirt shot, because that's what that scene needed. Now, I'm not saying the story significance of this guy dying isn't sad, but the show had no faith that its audience would grasp the gravity of the situation, so it had to draw everything out and explain each individual part to us, rather than just letting him blink out of existence the way someone would if they were killed in a battle setting like this. And the result is, unfortunately, just a kind of muddled mess. Now, let's compare that to how Araki handles death scenes. From part 2 onwards, there's
Caesar's
a very
one was
specific
like,
way Araki writes death, and that is that it's sudden, brutal, and often completely unexpected. Characters blink out of existence in an instant, and it can be totally heartbreaking. And once they're gone, they're very much gone, and they're not coming back. Not only does this apply a lot of poignancy and consequence to the combat encounters in JoJo's, but it also makes the world of JoJo's feel like death really happens, and when it does, it's as brutal and unfair as it is in real life. Caesar's death against Wham in part 2 is the beginning of Araki's new approach to death. It certainly foreshadowed more than deaths would be later in JoJo's, but the finality and cruelty of it still hits home, made even more tragic by the fact that early on in the fight it looks like we're going to see Caesar overcome Wham, and take his place alongside Joseph as a true hero. And when this doesn't happen, it packs a real emotional gut punch. Caesar simply feels like too important a character to be killed off, and when the large stone cross crushes him, it feels nearly unnecessarily cruel, but drives home just how final his death is, and the effect it has on Joseph has a real weight to it. He had no idea that the time in the snow would be the last time the two saw each other, and Caesar's sudden loss of life hits way harder because of it. It's also interesting to note that the reason Caesar's power is bubbles is because Araki thought that a bubble so fleeting and magnificent would be an adequate metaphor for Caesar's place in the story.
Wow.
To me, this works so much better than Grimgar's slow and vaguely confusing death scene, and something Araki would grow more adept at writing over time. It's aspects like this and so many others that elevate Battle Tendency so far beyond Phantom Blood. While I think I enjoyed part 1 with a wry smile in places, part 2 is what really opened me up to JoJo's and made me a
goes out there, doesn't it? It's like boom.
It's insane to watch a creator take so many of the aspects that didn't work in his first attempts and completely refine them to the point that they become his greatest strengths. The next time Araki would make such a dramatic leap forward would be nearly 20 years later, with 2005's seminal masterpiece, Part 7, Steel Ball Run. But for now, Battle Tendency stands as a story nearly 3 decades old that hasn't aged a single day. It represents the creative maturity of one of manga's greatest living authors. And even more than that, Battle Tendency is where JoJo's really became JoJo's. If part 1 is the body, part 2 is very much the soul, and one that only burns stronger and brighter over time. And this, my friends, is why you should watch JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 2, Battle Tendency.
It is
guys,
great.
that is going to do it once again for this video. I really hope you enjoyed, and again, I just want to say how much I appreciate all the likes, subscribes, and comments. I'm aware that sometimes there can be a bit of a wait between videos, and the main reason for this is just life stuff getting in the way, not any lack of
All your videos are just so good though.
I have a ton of ideas for future videos.
I really don't mind how long you
videos
have in between videos and that.
Very long time. In the meantime, you can follow me over on Twitter at iPatchWolf, or catch me over on the Let's Fight a Boss podcast. Friends, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time.
So good. But yeah, part 2 was brilliant, because I did enjoy part 1, but then part 2 just goes balls to the wall, and interesting characters and a lot more stuff going on. It's bam. Part 3 is my favourite. I like the whole journey aspect of it. I think that's what I like about stuff like, you know, when you're trying to get to point A to point B, and then seeing how they get there. I found that really interesting, but I will agree that the villain in part 4 is a much more interesting villain than all the other previous, even more interesting than Dio. Dio's just horrible and just evil and just Kiro is interesting, but yeah, so I'll watch why you should watch part 3 next, and then and I think you guys are enjoying these reaction videos, so yeah, and I just love anything JoJo's at the moment. See how long I can drag this out for, because once I get an idea in my head and I start liking something and I find videos I can watch, I tend to just keep going for ages. But anyway, thank you guys very much for watching. What did you guys think of that? What did you guys think of this? Click like, subscribe if you haven't already, leave comments down below, let me know what I should watch and discuss in future videos, and I'll see you guys, yes, all you guys, next time.